Well, hello there. This is a quick introduction to the LightSwitch documentation. In particular, it is a one in a number of series of videos that we'll create that will discuss the documentation of the MSLS.JS script from the LightSwitch product. For those that are new to LightSwitch, I would highly recommend that you go to Microsoft and to the LightSwitch forum or to the MSDN areas for LightSwitch and learn more about LightSwitch. It's a wonderful product for creating line of business solutions in a very rad manner. This particular documentation discussion will be around the help document that we've created. That is basically it breaks down the JavaScript definition or parses the JavaScript file associated to the LightSwitch, the core LightSwitch script itself, which is MSLS.JS. So, for example, if we take a look at a particular script, we'll just take a look at this one here. So this is the MSLS version 2 that's available today for the HTML5 client. And if you look at this, it's like any other JavaScript program or script. You start at the start and you can start winding your way through the various methods, functions and variables that are associated to the script. But one thing that you will learn about the MSLS script itself is that it's very, very complex. And at the end of the day, for those that are interested in learning more about how to navigate through it, we have provided a HTML version of what I'm about to show you online. So what I'll show you now is the actual output for the CHEM file. And so what we've done is we've kind of broken it down into two core areas, a variables area and a function scopes area. If we look at the variables, you can see that variables are sorted alphabetically by the names. So we have the jQuery, simplified version of the jQuery, which comes from jQuery. jQuery is actually defined from window.jQuery. So this is referencing the I guess the global variable jQuery that is made available once you include that script within your HTML project or file. But as we go down, we'll also notice another thing associated to this is that we have a number of references. So as we were looking at jQuery, you can see there's quite a few references associated to jQuery. And each one of these is referencing where that dollar sign variable is utilized within the application. So if I click on here, for example, and scroll down, somewhere within this area here, we will see, there it is, the usage of jQuery. So what this does is it also breaks down the some of the dynamic type definitions that occur within the application. So type definitions they're either defined in JavaScript directly, or in the case of the script, this particular script, they are defined dynamically. So let's take a look at, for example, classes. So when we look at classes, we can see that it's using this MSLS_define class function to define and create a class called AutoDisposeChangeListener. And if we drill into this, we can see that under the covers, just back up for a second, MSLS define class is actually calling this define class, and define class passes a parent, a class name, a constructor, a base class, some instance, and static members. So those that are familiar with Win.js might recognize this as, just pull this over here for a sec, might recognize this as a Win.js class define and or Win.js class derive. So basically what these two functions do is they dynamically create a class based on the parameters that are passed in. So in this case here for win.js class.define, it passes in a constructor. And in this case, the constructor is the third parameter that comes in define class. So let's just go back and take a look. The third parameter here is this method, this function here called AutoDisposeChangeListener. Now, in a lot of cases, when you look at the JavaScript implementation of this particular set of code, you might even see in here the actual definition of the function. And what this documentation does is it breaks it out so that you just see the function itself. And you notice here in the parameters that are being passed in. And you can see here that obviously in this scenario here, there's a need to set me so that it's probably called in some of the other sub-scoped functions beyond this one here. But as you can see here, in this particular function, AutoDisposeChangeListener simply sets some properties, source, property name, and listener to the values that are coming in through here. So this would be referring to the scope of the function that's actually outside of this particular the function scope. That's the enclosing function scope of this particular function. So if we now scroll back and go back into our define class again and go into here, you'll notice that it has a parent as well as a class name. So the parent in this case is MSLS. Essentially, what's happening here is that it's creating this MSLS dot AutoDisposeChangeListener. And we can see that actually if we look back here, this is basically its definition. And if you look in the script, you will see references to MSLS dot AutoDisposeChangeListener. So simply looking at that in the JavaScript gives you more or less a headache because you don't know how it's actually come to be. And in this case here, we are able to navigate and kind of see that and its availability. The second thing, I guess the fourth parameter that's being passed in determines whether this is creating a new class from this constructor and its instance members, or it's deriving from a class. So it's using the object prototype capabilities and win.js derive to be able to create from the base class. So when we look at this define class, you can see that if it doesn't have a base class, or it's null, passed in null, which in this example right here, it is null, it's going to call, whoops, go back forward here. It's going to call win.js.class.define, pass in the constructor. Again, the constructor in this case was this method, this function rather. It is going to pass in the standard instance members. Standard instance members is actually being created at the start here from the instance members that comes in. It does that through calling this process members function. Again, we click on process members, we'll get an idea of what's happening here. If you look at any variable, member variable or member within JavaScript, it has all members have these properties called configurable, enumerable, and so on, and writable. And what process members does is it creates a list of keys from the members properties that comes in, and enumerates each one of these keys or members, and looks to see if the member is of type object, and in this case not type object, and looks to see that it's not a value, does not have a value in its name, it does not have a get member within its within member. Also, it's looking to see that it's not a function, and it's not it does not contain a function called define on, and so forth. And so basically, process members is setting up the members in an array that is going to pass back, to this variable called standard instance members. does the same thing for static instance members. We're going to learn a bit more about instance and static members in a little bit, but basically an instance members would be when you create a new up or you new up a new version of this class or this type. These would be properties and functions that you could call from the instance variable or instance version of the type. Static members are members that you can call directly against the type itself. So let's take a look now at Win.js class define. The nice thing about this documentation is what we've tried our best to include as much of the existing API documentation that exists on the net for things like Win.js. And in this case here, we're looking at the Win.js define function. And if you look down here, there's some pretty good examples of what happens in Win.js define, class define. So we can see here that here's that constructor that was being passed in. So if we go back up, there's the constructor, the instance members, and its static members. So if we look here, we see the constructor, in this case, this little robot example. It's being passed in a value of name, and it's setting it to a variable or a property called name within the new type called robot. Now in this case here, this example, these are the instance members. Now if you recall, our instance members are actually going to be passed in and processed and then passed in to the method. So for example, if we go back up one, our instance members here are onDispose. So we have this new type called MSLS.AutoDispose change listener, and it has a member of an instance member of called _onDispose. Specifically, when you see an underscore, it's denoting that it's a private variable. Although you cannot make anything private within a JavaScript function, but it's more of a nomenclature that's adopted across most of Microsoft scripts. And you can see here the actual implementation of onDispose is here. And once again, it's in this case here, it's casting this me to this to basically get the inner scope, which is the scope that's associated to the actual class. And from there, it can get the source and assign that to a variable, to a source property, and then it's doing this remove change listener. And there's more about this here later on. We'll talk about that in probably another video. But basically, it's to handle when the instance is being disposed. But let's go back into our define class and go back into define member and look at that example one more time. So here we go. We have this robot. It's got a constructor with which takes this string variable and assigns it to a property called this.name. And then it has these instance members. One's called model and model name. The next one is a function called on and a function called off. And here is the example of some statically defined members: harms humans, gets models, and so forth. So now you can see that once this is called and created, you can create an instance of robot, in this case my robot, passing in the name, which would basically set this variable here. And then my robot.modelName is an instance member of the Win.js class defined robot being set to that. And you can see now you can call this on function, which would actually call through here and do that. Notice how the static members are actually referenced directly against the defined type itself. So we have robot.harms humans and robot get models to get the models. So that's pretty cool. So if we go back, we can see that when we're defining these classes, what Microsoft is doing in MSLS.JS is they are defining these dynamic types to do very specific things and taking advantage of Win.js across the board. So we won't go into too much more detail there. That's for you to discover as you go through and navigate through the script. But basically, you can see here there is quite a few of these classes that are created at runtime, and different namespaces are utilized. So we have this, in this case here, we have this MSLS UI content item clone, and you can see this is using this defined class. If we take a look here, you can actually see, we didn't actually cover this earlier, but you have this base class, you have this other class, sorry, the derived class, which is if we pass in, I think this actually is an example of that. Yes, it is. So the fourth parameter, let's do something like a button, so you can see this a little clearer. So when you see this defined class, you notice that it's pushing this into a namespace UI.controls. The name of the class is button. The constructor is this code right here called button, and you can see here it's basically calling this control and passing itself in the view that gets passed in to button itself. And you can see here it's deriving from MSLS_UI control. So if we go and look at that, let's see what the definition of that is. We can see that it's also one of these dynamically created types with a namespace of UI type of control, and here's its constructor. So as we go on and on and on, we can see that there is quite a bit of great value in looking at this script from the perspective of a compiled help file per se. So I won't go into too much more detail about, as I say, drilling into this stuff. Now, some of the links are falsely defined. That will improve over time because it's difficult to determine specific variables because a variable could be referencing, for example, an inner scoped value. So we'll get into that in a little bit, where that comes into play. Details, basically class with details is just another instance of defined class, except for it's augmented with additional details. So it has these additional values here, so simple members and detailed members, and it's using MLS mixin to existing class to mix in the simple members and so on for the detailed members. Mixins, if you're not familiar with mixins, provides the ability to add or extend to an existing class set of members. So you can actually get some pretty good documentation online to look at how this is actually done. Here's the mix in action here, and we'll just take a look at how this is done. So in this case here, it's using a very specific type of mixin, which is coming from the Win.js UI DOM mixin. But I strongly suggest that you take a look at some of these working examples that are available online that you will be able to navigate directly to from this documentation to understand exactly how how mixins work. But they're extremely powerful in extending a class or a type to have additional functionality or common functionality across multiple types. Excuse me. So getting back, for example, so define class with details is essentially calling the same defined class to build out the sort of the defined class, and then it's just using mixins to extend it with simple members and detailed members. So if we go back here, for example, we're looking at this thing called a business object, which is being applied to the MSLS namespace. That's shown here, and it's being passed in the details, which in this case here is business object details. So if we look at that, you can now see that business object details is basically calling this MLS object with details details, and so on and so forth. And we just keep going if you want. And one of the things that you'll see here, this is a good sort of segue into exposure, is that object with details is being exposed here through this MSLS expose method, And essentially what that does is it looks at, it sets a property on the external root. The external root is, in this case, MSLS is the variable. MSLS, the variable, is created at the very start of the application. And so basically expose, what MSLS underscore expose is doing is it's making these internal functions available to external script and or internal usage of within the script itself, just kind of making them highly available. So if you look here, we have this one here called MSLS underscore run, and you can see that it's derived through this MSLS underscore expose, and basically if we look here, this is actually the very first thing that the LightSwitch application calls through at startup, passing through, calling through .run. And if you look, you can see here this is default.html from your LightSwitch application. And as you can see, we have this MSLS dot underscore run. And so you can tell that this is actually a promise, which is an asynchronous function, which when successful will call through this method here, or this function, and if unsuccessful will call through this method here. So let's take a look at how does this get executed and start up within our script. So once again, we'll go back to our script, and just to recap, we'll go back one more. Again, we can see that within the script it has this MSLS underscore expose, and it's exposing this thing called underscore run, which correlates to that default code that we were just looking at earlier, which is right here. And if we go back to here, so oops, not that one, this one. And if we click on this, you can see that this is the actual function that default.html will actually call. It'll call this run. And you can see here it's doing things for tracking. These are code markers that Microsoft utilizes for test purposes to basically track execution of a particular set of functions. So they have this is enabled, which is looking at to see if there's this variable called underscore underscore MSLS test mode defined. And if so, basically it will track the variables. In this case here, it's flushing the out because this is the start of the application. And so it's it's got a number of things that it's looking at here, but these MSLS marks, you'll see them quite a lot throughout the code. I don't believe they're in the, I could be wrong, but they could be. I think they've been removed from the actual compressed version of the script, but nonetheless, that's what they are. And you'll see here that it's basically passing in this string as its first parameter, and this string is actually just, as you can see here, coming from this list of strings that they have available. And so we can ignore that a little bit and take a look at what's happening here. Here's an example of using jQuery to obtain a element within the DOM called body and assign it to body. And then as we kind of go down here, we can see the it's looking at this if statement to see if this app options enable modal scroll regions is defined. And if we just click on that, you can see that these are just set to null initially. So there's obviously something upstream of this that's actually assigning values to this, and we'll leave that to you to discover and unearth and how that actually happens. But basically, if that is defined, you can see that it's just using jQuery to add a class to the the DOM to add a class, and in this case, it is the enable modal scroll regions. And if you look at that, it's just really just a string that's being added there, and so on. So this is just kind of setting up the I guess some initial properties associated to the LightSwitch application itself. And then we have this WinJS promise. So we click on that. WinJS promise is basically has two inputs. init and on cancel. If we scroll back, we notice that in this case here, it's just passing the init function into the promise itself. So you can dig a little more into what a promise does, but it's extensively utilized throughout the script. In most scripts, promises is an asynchronous method of executing functions. So if we take a look here, every promise has two inputs. It has a complete function and it has an error function. So once the promise is successfully executed, it will call complete. And in doing so, it will, in this case here, it calls this jQuery function, looking for this MSLID app loading selector image IMG, I guess, and you can see here there's the value that it's looking for. So it's looking in the DOM for that particular variable or type, and once found, it's or not found, it calls error and basically does this, sets the hide. As you can see, I'm not really sure 100% what that's doing just yet. But one of the things I want to point out at this point here is you'll see that all of a sudden there's this link right in the middle of this function. And really what this is that this is a named function called application error that actually would sit, if you were to look at the code, this this function would actually be in line with this function here. To make it easier to read and kind of digest exactly what's happening within each function scope, we are removing these and providing links to the actual functions themselves. And in this case here, it's calling error and passing in, this could not be loaded, please try refreshing the page, and whatever that internal error is that's happening there. So we scroll back, and so that's the application error. And if we look at what's happening here, it's creating this promise. And in this promise, it's it's setting this the promise equal to this MSLS_resources ready. If we click on that, you can see that it's returning this thing called a ready promise. If we click on that, you can see that it's a ready promise is actually a Win.js promise, and with this particular function, anonymous function being passed in, you can see there's those two parameters, the on successful, complete, and on error. And you can see now we're looking at this, again, we go back to the promise itself. So this is the ready promise, and the ready promise is got a number of inline functions, load completed, get culture info, URI, and so on. The easiest way to look at something like this is actually to go to the end, because these inline functions are actually not called here, they're actually called down below. So if I was to look at, for example, what's happening in this block, from what I can see and understand is that the preferred language is a variable that, if defined, right, in this case it's saying if it's not defined and the preferred language does not equal English, then it says load culture info for the preferred language itself. And so if we look at what's going on here, you can see that again, here's that one of those inlined functions, culture info failed, and you can see that it's calling this culture error. And if we go back, we can see that we have these, this looks like a property variable loading, and it's creating this URI and called get culture, based on this get culture info URI, and passing in the language, which is something that's passed in. If we look at that, you can see that it's returning Ajax and all of this business here, plus the language, plus JS. So it's actually looking for a specific JavaScript reference as the URI, and then it's using jQuery.ajax and passing in the URI. The type is a script, and it will call the function scope on success. On error, it would call this particular function, which is you can see now calling that culture info failed. We saw that earlier, and load completed. And if we go back, we can look at function scope, and you can see that this would be once it's oops, daisy. I gotta back here. Once it's, I wanted to go this way, yeah. So on success of that call, that AJAX call, it will call this function here and basically take language to uppercase and takes these culture name that is, it enumerates globalized.culture. So if we look at what's going on there, this is the documentation around globalized culture. And it enumerates and looks to see that it has the culture name and it equals that, and if it does, it breaks, and so on and so forth. But once this is finished, it calls load completed. Now, where does load completed come into play? Well, if you recall, if you look at the side here, you can see that really what we've been doing is kind of navigating around this scope here. Again, we went through this earlier, and it had this load completed method at the top, right? And so loaded completed right here is actually going to call load complete within the scope, within the actual method itself. So when we were looking at this guy here earlier, you can see that we were actually drilling into what happens here, and then basically at the end here, it calls load completed. So after all of this, it would still call this load completed if this is not set, and does this load completed, and looks like it's doing a whole bunch of other stuff in here. So as you can see, this is just the tip of the iceberg as to what you can drill into and what you can discover through this method of documentation. And what I will point out though is we looked at sort of this exposed set of properties and what they're used for. We looked at these dynamically created classes or types, classes with details, the business, the data service, and the workspace. There's also a set of enumerations that are created throughout the project, and these are the names that you will see referenced within the application itself. And so when they're being used, it's actually being assigned here. Now you can see that I can go in here and I can see somewhere in here I will find, there it is right there, that the label position is defined through this mechanism here. So there's quite a little bit of an audit trail or tracing capability that you get when you look at this documentation. So these are just additional variables, quite a few global variables, and then some variables are have different namespaces. So like for instance, this one here is the array. Again, there's that defined class, and it's deriving from sequence array. Sorry, 1, 2, 3. This one, that's a constructor. This is the type that it's deriving itself from. All right. So that, remember, if we look at this guy, it's the base class, and the base class goes to derive. And what is MSL sequence? Well, we'll get into that if you want to, but basically it's just a function that provides capability to iterate over a particular array. So if we scroll down a little further, and let's take a look at, so we got globals. Now we got our function scope. So this really relates to the actual application itself. And so if we look at this, we see this function, define, use a strict. This should be quite familiar because this is actually what we were looking at earlier, which was this. So if we go to the top, okay, we see this function, Windows defined, use strict, and so forth. And if we go back to our script, you can see it is exactly that. Now the big difference here between this and what you see in the actual Visual Studio version is that wherever there is an anonymous function or an inline function scope, you will see it basically represented like this. And this refers to these. So these are your function scopes that exist within the script itself. As you can see, it's enormous as far as the number of function scopes that exist. And but with this particular documentation approach, you should be able to drill in and get a really good understanding as to what's happening and learn the value of it. And as we go into this function scope, you can see that it like the outer function scope, which is this big one here, each function scope itself has a representation of what that function scope has. So if we look here, we can see that we have this first function scope, and this first function scope does correlate to the function scopes in order as they're defined within the JavaScript itself. So if we look at, for example, object to string is a variable. It's calling this object.prototype to string, and basically get the prototype of MSLS. If it does not equal the object prototype, get the prototype of that or set it to null. This is setting that is library, right? So you'll also see that anywhere where there is a variable being set at a function scope level, we'll also break it down so that you can see the same variables there at the function scope level. Likewise, we break out the functions themselves. So for example, we have get URL parameter, and each one of these is a potential function scope in itself, right? So you could have functions within functions. Let's see if we can find an example of that. Probably not here, but you will see that throughout the script that there is functions within functions or function scope for sure all the way along. So so basically, each one of these has a set of variables associated to it that's in the function itself. And if we go back to our function scope, the best way to kind of go through this is to kind of look at the function scope. In this case here, this is this get parameter, and these names that are up here correlate to the functions that are within the actual function scope itself. So if we look down here, we can see that here's a lot of stuff that's being inline. Get cookie, get all cookie values, so forth. MLS is function is being set by this is function. If you recall, and you look up here, you can see that is function is being set or created. Actually, is function I think was created on the outside as a global variable. Let's see, where does it take us? It takes us to is function. Yeah, it's right. It's actually a function. So sorry, I apologize. It is a function. And then there's that MSLS expose. So it's actually really MSLS expose is actually this here, which looks at this external root. And if it has this external root is set, which is basically it's trying to get this MSLS variable parameter, and then it's using that as to set the name, set a property on there. So basically, the expose is setting a property, and the property could be of type variable or it could be of type function. And I don't see anything in version 2 that uses this parameter here. So basically, from what I've seen anyway. But one of the nice things about this particular script is that, or this documentation, is that you can look at, for instance, get cookie value, and you can see where get cookie value is used. It's used in get MLS get parameter and so forth, and get parameter. And by the way, if you look here, you can see that this is set up here. It's being defined all over the place, and so it kind of helps you to kind of understand what's going on and so forth throughout the script. So basically, when we're looking at the documentation, we're actually able to kind of navigate through and really get a good solid understanding as to what's happening under the covers with the script itself. So this particular version of documentation, this compiled help file, which is I think is probably the better of the two, is not free. This one is around, I think it's $79 is what we're pricing it at, and you'll be able to get it through the website itself. Whereas the there is a free version for the community that is available. And at $79, as we update the functional descriptions of each of the functions and variables within it, there will be different versions of this cranked out, so you'll be able to get more and more insight into what happens. Now, the one question that comes to mind is what happens when Microsoft comes out a second version or a third or subsequent versions of their scripts. This is actually code generated through a process called abstract syntax tree nodes. So um, uh, it's a process where we take the script itself, put it through this parser. The parser then looks through all of the members and builds out this hierarchical form, this documentation, and then it builds out individual HTML files and kind of glues it all back together. So the idea is that as Microsoft comes out with subsequent versions, we'll be able to run it through this parser. And when you buy the $79 version of this, you will be automatically provided the next version and any other subsequent versions associated to this documentation. There will be versions of this available for Win.js, Data.js, jQuery, and so on and so forth. So there will be a once you get sort of a feel for this type of documentation, it may prove to be quite useful in unearthing and discovering some of the other more complicated scripts that are on the market. Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to basically say that as we go through this process of documenting and understanding what Microsoft is building inside LightSwitch, the idea is that at a community level, we'll be able to come up with a better approach to integrating and extending their product. And as a community, we have the ability to further own what it is that Microsoft is doing, and take away some of the mystery as to what's happening, and become extremely good JavaScript programmers as a result of understanding exactly how the big boys build their scripts. So once again, thank you very much. My name is John LaRue, and I am from softlandingcanada.com. If you're interested in this documentation, please feel free to visit our website, and there will be a couple of links provided that will take you to the free version, which is the HTML version, which is completely yours to browse, and also this purchase version, which is in the compiled help itself. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.